wellnesscouch.com, streaming wellness into your lives.
Welcome to Nourishing the Mother, featuring your hosts Bridget Wood and Julie Tenner.
Hello and welcome to Nourishing the Mother. I'm Bridget Wood, and today we don't have Julie Tenner, but we do have two special guests. And we are going to be talking about when the personal is political with Andrew Hicks and Pippa Campbell from the Health Australia Party. Before we jump into that interview, I want to remind you to please jump online and connect with us. So we want you to hook up with our mailing list and our newsletter so that we can send you all of the juicy bits and pieces that we send out every week and whenever we get some flow of inspiration that we think might touch you in your world. And of course, we love your emails and your podcast suggestions too. So welcome, Andrew and Pippa. Hi.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So this is a bit of a shift for us. We've never really touched the topic of politics, but in fact, I ended up at a dinner party with you, Andrew, and we were having this very in-depth conversation, and I really felt like knowing our tribe so well and knowing that health is a really high value for so many of our listeners, it would be really worthwhile to unpack why even though for so many of us we can feel a little bit apathetic about politics, why it's important to understand a little bit about where our votes go and understand, I guess, how we can vote in alignment with what we really value. And there are it's an interesting landscape in Australia, particularly around healthcare and then around, I guess, a wellness model of care versus sort of a disease management model of care. And the Health Australia Party, I guess, as I understand it, is looking to tackle that in various ways. So I guess, Andrew, maybe you can take us through what the Health Australia Party's 5 pillars are, and then I'd love to hear from both of you about why you felt called to get political.
Yeah, great. Health Australia Party, we ran in the federal election in 2016 as well, and we're going into the Victorian election coming up, but we're trying to bring a bit of a difference to the political world with what the current options bring to the table and have been doing. So the 5 pillars for us are healthy people, healthy economy, healthy environment, healthy democracy, and healthy society. The interesting thing is there's a lot of one-issue parties around, but everything is connected. Every single topic affects another topic. If you don't have a healthy environment, how do you have healthy people? If you don't have healthy people, how do you have a healthy economy? And so on. Everything is interconnected with things on that front. So we're certainly not left-wing, not right-wing, we're a centre party. So we're trying to find a balance between all these different topics, everything together. And as well, obviously, with a bit of a key focus on healthy people, since it's quite a critical one that doesn't seem to be really getting addressed at the moment. Only things there.
So why politics? Were you always desiring to be a politician? Could you see yourself up there having robust debates, or was it something in your own life that called you there?
Never did I even remotely think about it. So in terms of, some people being quite apathetic towards politics, that's me.
Yeah.
That was me. So it's a bit of a long journey with things for me. Part of it's just my own health journey and things too, changing perspectives and learning about things. Having a fairly technical background in science and engineering, I kind of look at how things work. What about this? What about that? And
you love systems, I bet.
To a degree. But it's one of those things I kind of look at and I kind of just assume that so many things are the best thing for us. There's that assumption of if this is the standard practice, well, therefore it must be the best thing. It must have gone through, testing, methodology, research, all those sorts of things. But on my own journey, as I was learning more and more things with my own health, with other family members and things, start to see some cracks in the system. And then as the cracks emerge, you start asking questions.
It's a bit of a domino effect, isn't it? You kind of go, whoa.
Absolutely. And it was just kind of one thing after another. It was over a long period of time for me. But then also having kids as well. So I've got a couple of young kids. And, even going through the whole birthing process, through pregnancy, young kids and things, you start asking questions. Oh, what about this? What about that? Why are you doing that test? What about this? What about that? And then when there's answers that don't make sense, I just start to ask more questions. And then things start to, get even more confusing and things as well. And then start to see even more the cracks in the system there. And ultimately that leads to further things on that. And then also much more widespread in terms of the impact on society, on us as people, us as families, and then everything else tied in together, I kind of look at it and go, well, what do I want for my kids? Is this a process I want my kids to go through in whatever period of time? Do I want them to grow up in this environment? Not really.
It's amazing how much having children calls you into greater integrity in what you really value and forces you to think about the future in a way that perhaps you have never thought about it before.
Yeah, absolutely.
And simplifies it as well, I think. You know, we overcomplicate things as adults. Children see things quite purely.
Yeah.
And it makes you do that as well.
What about you, Pippa? What's your background and why did you feel called to jump in?
Well, I'm probably the opposite to Andrew in a way. In a way, I feel like I've always been interested in politics. I grew up in Tasmania, and politics actually was always part of the discussion because, you know, we're quite split as a state in terms of where our values lie, where our economic income lies. So it's always been something that was discussed at my dinner table. But I guess at this point in my life, I've spent the last 8 or 9 years working as a doula, supporting families through birth and pregnancy and the early parenting journey. And as I was doing that, I really discovered that helping people one-on-one was wonderful, but I could see all these other people falling through the cracks and seeing all the holes in the systems where people just wouldn't be able to get the help that they needed. And it felt to me like I needed to do more than that. So then I started working on a project to create some kind of centralised place where families could go and get all the support they needed. And I started working with local government and state government to try and make it happen, and big business as well. And that was a really astounding process because on one hand, I got more positive feedback than I expected. But I also got, you know, an eye into how, politics actually works and how you can be told, oh, that's great. Yeah, we'd love to support that. But they have absolutely no intention of doing anything about it. And I would describe myself as a pragmatic idealist. So I want the world to be better, but I want to know what I'm going to do to actually make it better, like really practical things. That
so you're not an armchair critic. You want to get in there and get your elbows in.
I totally do. I think I wake up every morning thinking, okay, what am I doing today to make the world just a little bit better? And even if yesterday I hit my head against a brick wall, what could I do differently today to make it better? And so that process led me to realise that if I really wanted to change things, I needed to be part of that system. It's easy to be critical of something.
Yeah.
It's much harder to stand up and go, well, maybe I'll do something about it. And I sort of feel that even I would absolutely love to get elected, but even if I wasn't elected, and I've seen the reaction in my community from my children, from schools from students at the school, or just from other people that I know, just being astounded that I would do something like this. It's like, yeah, you know, you could do it too.
Just the very process of putting yourself out there is changing other people's perceptions and perhaps their own belief in their own capacity to make change.
Absolutely, because we've prescribed politics and governing to certain people.
Yeah.
And then we complain about them, but that isn't the way government's meant to work. It's meant to represent the people. So if you want it to represent the people, you have to vote for people that represent you.
Yeah.
Not just kind of go, I guess I'll vote for that person, or I won't vote at all.
Yeah.
You know, which is becoming increasingly common.
I think that's it. I think people in such frustration at, you know, the two major parties and really the kind of the joke that politics has become.
Yeah.
People are just, you know, almost protesting by not, which is a shame because it feels like our votes don't count. But at the same time, when we do vote for, you know, choose where our vote goes with the smaller parties particularly, yes, you're not going to run the government, but you can block certain policies. You can have them reviewed, can't you? You can have things added in. Yeah. There's certainly things that when we get behind independent parties that represent our values and what we want to see in the world, my understanding is that those votes can count.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually what drew me to the Health Australia Party, besides the fact that they're a really middle-of-the-line party, which is very rare these days, and actually where I sit myself right in the middle.
I guess the one, when you were talking about being centre, it kind of reminded me of the old Democrats, like, you know, with like Natasha Sutton-Spoyer and...
No, I mean, that's a really good example because the idea of running candidates just in the upper house is about having that as a house of review. And the Democrats did that for a really long time. They were quite powerful.
And they really kept the two major parties like quite, accountable and in check, and they didn't let them kind of run away with things.
And I think people understood that that's how the system worked. You had your government and you had your house of review, and it made sense. And we've lost that concept. And I think it's a really important concept. And I think that is where we feel we can make a difference. And so I've spent a lot of time just through this campaign explaining to people, this is how the two houses work, and this is how you can put a smaller party into the upper house and it can make a massive difference. Yeah, and I think that's quite empowering.
It is, yeah. There's a bit of a shift within the publicity side of things, especially within the federal election, to try and keep minor parties out of either the Senate or the upper house. Yeah. And they're saying, but, then we can't get anything done. But that's the whole point of that system.
Yeah. So that what is getting done is actually considerate to as broad a people as possible. And I guess I can see why the two major parties don't want it, because smaller parties get in the way. They kind of block their agenda. Yeah. But if we want a really democratic and just society, then we need that. We need that that critical attention on policy.
And that transparency as well. And also that representation from people that remember what it's like just to be an ordinary person. Some of the major parties will talk about it, but the reality is that most of them don't live like most people live.
Yes. Yeah.
So if they create policy that affects people in a very small way, and they think that doesn't matter, statistically that doesn't matter.
And maternity care is a perfect example. We know, like, it's in it that, yes, Australia has, a great medical system in many ways, but we still have soaring rates of postnatal depression and, postnatal anxiety and, really big problems with birth trauma, and helping families ground themselves and bond.
Yes.
And that's a symptom of a system that's not working for many women.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's an example of the people in power, largely men, who aren't really close to, what's really going on.
Absolutely. Well, my project of setting up these centres called The Nest was exactly that. And I remember having a discussion with a room full of men in suits who had a lot of money between them, and we're really like, oh, that's fantastic. And then one of them said, and you know what? Maybe you could train nannies for us as well, because they never take out the garbage. The nannies never take out the garbage.
Oh, my gosh.
And I just remember my jaw dropping, just going, wow, you have no idea what it's a
different world.
It's a totally different world.
I guess, it's unfortunate that I think so many women after their first or second birth experience don't quite realise that the system isn't system set up for the system to work. It's not so much set up for you individually to have a great experience in that system.
Yeah.
So I love that you guys are addressing the maternity care piece. There are some, I guess, attacks that are made on the Health Australia Party. The media love to have a go. I know the AMA had a bit of a dig recently.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that they had an issue with, that they felt like you were the anti-vaccine party, which of course is going to make the news because it's such a topical thing at the moment. What do you say to that?
I don't know where they get that idea from. It's one of those things that seem to be perpetuated through media or possibly through other parties and things. I know some other parties, one in particular, has even tweeted things, something like even just last week, saying that we're the anti-vax, anti-fluoride party, and it's a deceptive name and things. I'm like, have you read the policies? That's not the position that we take. We haven't from day one. Things have just been twisted and they're perpetuating lies. Ultimately, it's as simple as that. What we do oppose is the no jab, no pay and no jab, no play policies.
Yeah.
They're using coercion to get a person to take a pharmaceutical product, a drug, that breaches informed consent. It's as simple as that. Whether somebody chooses to do vaccines, whether they choose not to, that's an individual's choice, as with every other medical procedure on the face of the earth. They actually breach their own guidelines by doing this policy. It's quite astronomical. It also then raises the question of the slippery slope of, well, what next? Well, what other drug might they want to mandate? Oh, sorry, not mandate, but put things in place to coerce people into doing it.
Yeah.
The ironic thing is it's portrayed as if you don't support those policies, you're anti-vax.
Yeah.
No, we just don't like the government strong-arming people, forcing them to do it.
Yeah. As I understand it, the Law Institute of Victoria took issue with that too, didn't they?
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's quite a lot of organisations that oppose it that are within the medical world. So there is the Law Institute of Victoria. There's quite a few others as well. With things as well, which I had written down here.
It was, you can come back to that. I understand too that it was a very big sustained media campaign. Like I think that the Murdoch Press really took that and ran with it. There was an interesting book that I read by Dr. Brian Martin. He's a professor in Sydney, and he studied the sustained attacks on the vaccine issue essentially, and the attempt to polarize public opinion in order to get through a policy like this, which in any other area you really wouldn't expect to get through, because it is very coercive and people don't like to be, generally Australians don't like to be told what to do.
Yes.
But this one interestingly got through.
Yeah.
And without a great deal of public opposition.
Absolutely. Well, it's because you're using fear, the fear of something happening to your child. But I support a lot of families who have a range of views, and the things that I hear more often is just we want to be able to ask.
Ask questions.
It's got a lot more to do with the attitude than the actual result.
Yes.
It's how you treat people, whether they have a right to ask what happens to their child in any situation. Whether they have the right to be flexible. So many, it's very similar to the whole maternity system, where a lot of rules are there because it's a system and it works better just to have
a blanket
rule. But there needs to be flexibility within that. And even within the immunisation schedule, there are doctors that will answer questions, but there are just so many that just shut it down with a very arrogant sort of approach of, I know you don't, and that's it.
And I think too, you've got the issue with the regulator who really has come down so hard now that even doctors who might have an opinion that is contrary to the schedule or contrary to what's instructed by the government can't speak out.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
that's ultimately dangerous for the public.
Well, that's not democracy.
No, and I think it's also not really in the interest of the doctor-patient relationship, because for some patients they will be contraindicated, so that needs to be a safe conversation, but it's not anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did you bring it up?
Yeah. Well, my laptop just completely freaked out and froze, so that's always great timing. So some of the ones that oppose the no demo phase is like the Victorian Council for Civil Liberties. They say the policy cannot be justified from an ethical point of view. Yeah. There's the SARC report, so it's a Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee. So there's a Victorian government body. Effectively, they kind of do like an ethics review of legislation. And they crafted their response very delicately, and they said a less restrictive alternative approach should be employed, i.e., no, don't do this.
Yeah.
The Victorian Law Institute, as you mentioned, but there's also the Royal Australian College of Physicians.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah.
What did they say?
I don't have a quote from them specifically, but they don't agree with the policy as well. So, amongst other health practitioners and doctors and things too.
I think it's also that piece, ultimately it is disadvantaging children because they're either having to make that choice between health or education. And I think education is also another expression of health. And so if we don't give children access to that, that's not in the interests of society either. That's not in the interests of our future nation. So it is a bigger thing. But whether there's any attention that gets put back on it, we don't know.
Yeah. And it's also a useless policy because it's really aimed at punishing people who have less resources and generally aren't the ones, if you look at who's not vaccinating, it's actually well-educated people with good financial resources that are not going to be affected by this policy at all. So it's really punitive.
Yeah. Which I guess leads us to probably another question or another topic, because one of the attacks against the party was by, I think, somebody from the AMA saying that, it's not right to be focusing so much on, natural medicine because I think we need to be focusing more on, evidence-based medicine. But as we know, there was a recent quote from I don't know if he's still the editor of The Lancet, Richard Horton, but, he came out and said, now, like, there is just so much corruption in research and pharmaceutical industry that it's very, very difficult to get truly unbiased information and research.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that they make that claim that it's, that medicine is so evidence-based when, we're increasingly finding that the line between, true unbiased medicine and corporate vested interest medicine, it's a bit muddy.
Absolutely. I think it's that specific quote you're talking about. I think he said something about as much as maybe half of the research is invalid for those reasons.
Yeah.
That's massive.
Yeah.
That's like a yes, no, take a pick, throw a dartboard.
Yes. Yeah.
Side of things. It's so hard to filter what's actually good, reliable scientific research versus what's either one, not reliable from whether it be sample size, poor methodology,
selective reporting,
changing criteria, which is probably one thing we'll probably get to.
Yeah.
Or just simple who's funded the study.
Yes.
It's quite uncommon for a company to fork out a lot of money to conduct research and then say, we've found our product's useless. We're not going to pursue it after all our research and development.
It's interesting you make that point because my other business, Suburban Sandcastles, we had Dr. Craig Hassett, who's the professor of general practice. He kind of runs the general practitioners at Monash, and he's got a really strong interest in mindfulness. And he was saying on the Q&A panel at our event, he was saying, if the pharma companies could patent going for a walk and eating well, everybody would be doing it.
Yeah.
But they can't. So these are, but they still, for many approaches to healthcare, it is here, take this drug.
Yeah.
Because that's what they can make money off.
Yeah.
And I know Herbert Benson, who came up with mindfulness-based stress reduction, I think that was him, was saying it took him 15 years to get enough funding for a study into that.
Yeah.
Because no one would fund it because it wasn't, you couldn't make money off it essentially. Yeah. So I think it's very interesting to open our eyes to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Which that also then means, so if there's no money to be made off it, then who needs to do the research and who needs to fund it? Well, the only real option is either one, the public fund it themselves, which is
very unlikely.
Very much so. Or it's government funded.
Yeah.
And if it's government funded without vested interests involved, that's when you can get some really, really good research. And actually, you use so many incredibly talented and intelligent people around to actually do the research that's actually going to be beneficial.
Yeah. And that is ultimately where we need greater representation in our government to ensure that we can have more of that happening.
Absolutely. I don't think there's anybody who disagree that, pretty much everybody wants more research into the natural medicine side of things.
Yeah.
Most people, including practitioners, say we need more research. We need more evidence-based. Yes, this might have been used for 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years, depending on what it is.
Yeah.
But to tick the scientific criteria tick box.
Which people today, we're so obsessed with like evidence and science and needing that, that naturally we need to find a way for natural medicine to do that.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes it's like comparing apples and oranges, and you can't really introduce randomized controlled trials to a product of medicine that doesn't kind of fit that.
Yeah.
So it's about how do we compare the two. I mean, I know the former AMA chief executive, Dr. Karen Phelps, like she was an integrative doctor, and I think that did a lot of work in that space. So it's interesting to see, how the cultures shift depending on who's at the helm as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I think is sometimes a bit of a misconception about Health Australia Party too, is often it's perceived as we're anti-pharma as such. Look, there certainly needs to be checks and balances put in place, but we actually don't want to get rid of the pharmaceutical industry. We actually want to work together.
Yeah.
Natural medicine, different forms of, not every single modality in natural medicine is right for every scenario. Just like every drug is not right for every scenario.
That's exactly the point.
And, pharmaceuticals are life-saving as well. So,
Absolutely. Exactly.
Everyone's going to throw that up.
I think it's also that piece, ungoverned power corrupts. And so it's how do we, in any situation, because like if you could flip it and we had, all of a sudden we're talking about natural medicine as, dominating the world, then we'd be having the same conversation.
Yeah.
It's about how do we bring integrity here.
Yeah. And transparency.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then we can decide for ourselves.
And so I guess, how do you get the message out when you do find that the media does twist what you're about? Is it looking at the bigger picture of your other policies that aren't so hot button? You know, how do you try to get the message through? Because ultimately a lot of Australians, I mean, as we know, like wellness as an industry is growing exponentially. So people are really caring more about taking charge of their health. And it seems like you guys are kind of a representative party for people who have those values, but it's how do you get through?
That's really hard. Look, I can't see us getting, big front page stories on us in the mainstream media or nice spot on the news at night and things. So hence there's a lot of groundwork that we have to do.
Yeah.
So, speaking to people like yourself and many other people who have got a similar value set as well.
Yeah.
But it also comes down to just people.
Yeah.
The simplest thing is, if one person talks to another person and they talk to 10 and they talk to 10 and they talk to 10 and they talk to 10, all of a sudden the numbers increase quite substantially to actually get the word out. The hardest thing for us is people just even knowing we exist. The vast majority of the time people look at policies and go, oh, wow. Like in one way that's kind of sad because a lot of the policies to me are fairly straightforward and simple. We're just not trying to do vested interest and trying to get that balance with things. It's a bit more common sense with a lot of things, but people to know that we exist is our biggest challenge.
Yeah.
So that's where, every single person needs to get involved. And, like I used to be quite apathetic in the political world. Nowadays, not quite so much so.
Yeah. You can't really say
a lot
that
more
you're
active
that
now. But we have to talk to people about it. Politics is such a taboo topic. There's a quote that I heard a while back. I can't remember exactly what it is, but something along the lines of, for too long we've been told not to talk about difficult things like politics and religion. Instead, we should be taught how to have a respectful discussion about politics and religion.
It's so true because ultimately, we get programmed by the messages around us anyway. So if we're unable to talk about them and, explore our own views and be willing to change them and transform them, then we're ultimately going to be subconsciously influenced by what we see and read anyway. So it's actually important to bring consciousness to it.
Yeah.
I used to be super into politics. Like before I had kids in my 20s, I was like one of those people who went to election parties, and like I still know how to make sure I can vote below the line. And even though I don't know what half the parties are now, I just choose based on their name. So I probably would have chosen Health Australia Party anyway because I like health, but I wouldn't have known anything about it. So I'm glad that you've told us a bit about it. But it is interesting, I think, too, and your life shifts so much out of independent, person unto themselves, and now you're a parent. I'm glad that we're having this conversation because I know so many other mothers would be really probably disconnected from these bigger issues that we're having and that we need to bring to light.
Well, and the reality is that no one's really standing on a platform of supporting families and women and women's health. And, that's something no one's talking about.
Yeah. And, because we know how much of the media is still so many journalists are male. Like, I find this fascinating when I try to pitch media releases on certain films. Like, I know if it's a film about women or it's just not going to run. The media release just won't run because and it's not necessarily the fault of anyone, but it has to connect with the person reading it. And if that journalist can't connect with this message, then it's not really going to fly. And so that is why, understanding how our media is constructed, understanding how our governments are constructed, and how because of, so many men in there, because of so many dominant values in there, that's what then sets the public agenda. And so by bringing our own critical thought about who's writing this, where's it coming from, who's paying for that, who's their major advertiser, that's all important stuff to look at. I don't know what the stats are in the States, in Australia, but I know in the States, I think 70% of advertising is pharmaceutical.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's a figure about 70 to 80 or something like that in my head as well. Yeah.
And I know if you go there, like you see.
Yeah, you just so many.
Yes, ads after ad after ad. And in fact, I used to work in TV advertising, and one of the major clients, even in Australia here, was a pharma company. And so, rightly or wrongly, that sets a dominant message. It sets kind of what we are, bathing in, I suppose.
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting one as well. Actually, Pippa and I were talking on the way here as well, and we're talking briefly about a lot of people distrust mainstream media.
Yes,
like that's a pretty common theme these days. We all know there's an agenda, there's a bias, which is exactly what it's not meant to do. It's meant to be an unbiased presenting the facts so you can make up your own mind.
Yeah. Crazy
concept, apparently. I'm sure there's still a lot of journalists who are actually good and are trying to do the good things as well.
Yeah, I know.
But the underlying theme, and especially on key hot topics where it seems to saturate the media, The weird thing is, though, most people have this distrust of media, yet still listen at the same time.
Yeah.
And I don't get it.
And I notice it too. And like, I'm fairly conscious of what I consume, but I still know that I'll be like swayed by something just by virtue of hearing it, and particularly if it was a message delivered that was very carefully copywritten, and maybe it was a fear kind of undertones. You are shaped by that.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important to bring awareness to that, and therefore of obviously what we consume, and the fact that our Facebook feeds are like organised to show us what we believe. I'm pretty sure that's how it's now.
Social media has completely changed that media landscape.
Yeah, it really has.
Yeah,
and so it's
created our own worlds to confirm everything we think about the world. Yeah,
which is really dangerous.
Yeah, it's really dangerous. And I mean, we even have that, I think, in Melbourne to an extent of Victoria and an extent of Australia, because we're actually quite different from the rest of Australia in the way we think about things. And so we live in our own little bubble, and we think that the rest of the world lives like that.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important to make people think about how other people think, even if it's really different from you, that it's really important to understand how other people live and why they make their choices.
And that's also how we find the edges, our own edges, and how to grow through them, because we need to have our buttons pushed, because it's almost like traveling. There's a great quote, travel is the enemy of ignorance.
Yeah.
Because you are constantly facing so many different experiences that all of a sudden you're finding yourself having to reorganize how you thought the world was and how you thought you were in that world.
Yes, absolutely. So we took our family, our 3 kids, to Japan last year.
Oh, yeah.
And for that reason, particularly, I chose Japan. I grew up with a lot of Japanese influence in a small country town in Tasmania, which was bizarre. But my elder sister went on an exchange to Japan, and we had 3 exchange students over a couple of years living with us.
What a rich experience.
It was. And it was really, because I was quite young. I was the youngest. So I was 6 when we had our first exchange student. So for me, it just became normal. But for everyone else around me, it was quite a redneck area, and there were definitely not many Asian people. They'd maybe never even seen an Asian person before. And they would make funny jokes and rude jokes on the school bus. And I'd just be looking at them going, I don't actually
even understand that.
I don't even understand that. I actually don't understand that. And then, my daughter's about to turn 10, and she was getting to that point in her life where everything's quite secure. Her life's quite privileged. She, has strong values about the world that she sees it within her little bubble. And I thought, now is the time where she needs to realise that the whole world doesn't see things the same way, and there's not necessarily a right or a wrong. There's just a whole lot of perspectives. So we went to Japan, and of course Japan is so different.
Yeah.
And we went to this tiny town that I had just found on a map, which I didn't know anything about, but it was near the coast, and we stayed in this beautiful place just on the water, and we went for a walk. And it turns out that this town had this story about these samurai soldiers that supported the leader at that time, who had some kind of beef with his tutor from years before and tried to kill him. And because he tried to kill someone, he had to commit suicide, because that's against their code. But the samurai soldiers were assigned to him. They had pledged themselves to him. So it was then their job to try and kill that tutor that he had tried to kill.
Oh, my gosh.
Because that was their honour.
Yes. Wow.
So they spent 2 years doing that. And then they all had to commit suicide.
Because they had killed someone. Oh, my gosh.
And they have a huge stone statues of all these samurai soldiers. And once every year in this tiny town, which has like 1,000 people in it, 35,000 people come, and there's a huge parade, and they celebrate that.
Wow.
And so my daughter, we kind of came across it, and she just started doing her own research on it. She was just fascinated. And I'm like, yes, this is exactly it. This is a conundrum that makes no sense to a Western mind.
Yeah.
But is just fascinating about how we relate to each other.
And human behaviour. Like
human behaviour and your code of conduct and what honour means. And it's just so important
to learn to see the world differently and how other people live.
To stretch your mind. Yeah.
What a great experience.
It was, yeah.
I love it. Now, another candidate for the Health Australia Party is Dr. Isaac Golden, who is kind of mainstay in natural medicine, particularly homeopathy. And I understand he does a lot of work in India and I think Cuba and some other countries that have homeopathy medicine alongside Western medicine. And it's quite well regarded in those countries and has a demonstrable amount of research to us, as I understand it. But in Australia, which we found out, in fact, with another film that Suburban Sandcastles did called Just One Drop, which looked at the history of homeopathy and then spent quite a bit of time addressing an NHMRC, which is an Australian government body, a review into homeopathy, which found that it had no evidence of efficacy and effectiveness. And it was to watch this and this unfold in this film, it was quite damning towards homeopathy until they started to look at all of the holes in the study, which is now I understand before the ombudsman because of just how, perhaps falsified the study might be. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it's a bit of a rabbit hole. It's one of those crazy ones where you go, oh, okay, they've done a report and they found this. Oh, okay, that's a bit odd. But yeah, as you start to peel back the layers of it, it just gets more and more astounding with what's actually going on. So they actually did the NHMRC, so it's a National Health and Medical Research Council. So it's a government-funded body. It's somewhere around $800 million a year that they spend on medical research. Very, very little on natural medicines. Barely anything at all. So they've commissioned a report to find out with homeopathy, basically go, is there any clinical effectiveness for treating specific health conditions? They produced what's referred to as the first report, which was actually quite favourable to homeopathy. They've since buried that report.
That didn't even get released, though, didn't it?
No.
The film explained that they had sacked the person who produced that first report. Or they removed him from the
from the evaluation committee. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so
and called in a new committee or called in somebody else to review it again.
Yeah, so there's conflicts of interest on the committee for the second report.
Yeah.
The existence of the report is known from Freedom of Information requests.
Yeah.
They're still waiting for the report to be released. That's one of the big things that they're pushing for.
So it hasn't been released, even
the
with those
report
requests?
hasn't been released. No.
Wow.
So it's a big issue. So then they did their second report, and they changed their evaluation criteria. The number one thing with medical research is you establish your methodology, you establish your criteria at the start. That's your baseline.
Yeah.
And then you measure your evidence studies. What are you doing against that? If you set it partway through.
But once you're starting to get some
Exactly.
data.
Once you get in results, you then start changing your criteria to facilitate an outcome. So they changed their whole criteria. There's a number of different things that they did with it. They changed, I'm going off memory, they changed the sample size to be a minimum of, I think it was 200 or 250 people in the study, which eliminates a lot of really good quality evidence just in smaller groups. If it was 150, it'd be eliminated. They changed there's a thing called the Jdad Score. So it's basically how good is this quality research? If it's really bad methodology and things, it'll get a score of like 1 or 2 or something. But if it's good quality research, it'll be a 3, 4, 5 being the top. When there's systemic reviews, often done by like the Cochrane collaboration and ones, typically what's used is a 3, 4 and a 5. They eliminated everything except for 5s. Wow. So it's eliminated a whole heap of really good research at 3s and 4s that they've managed to get out of the evaluation as well. So there's a whole heap of things that they did with those ones being part of it. And effectively the end result of all that basically meant that their determination was there is no clinical effectiveness for homeopathy with treating whatever health conditions. So the thing is around that criteria change is in 2015, the NHMRC had a media release where they said that report was a result of a rigorous examination of the evidence and used internationally accepted methods for assessing the quality and reliability of evidence. That's critical. So they'd said in 2015 that they've used internationally accepted methods. There's a question through one of the senators federally earlier this year about it, and the NHMRC finally responded, and they actually said that at the time this work was underway, there was no relevant guidance or standard endorsed by NHMRC or a relevant international organisation on the development and content of evidence statements. So they're making an evidence statement based on this research, which they said is based on internationally accepted methods, and now they're saying is Yeah.
That there was none, so we made up our own.
Exactly. They could have used international standards, but they didn't. They changed the whole thing. And the whole premise of it is that it's based on internationally accepted methods, but they changed it and it's not. So they're basically making up their own criteria, which you just don't
to facilitate
do.
a desired outcome to fit the agenda.
Yeah. So the homeopathy report was done in 2015, I think it was. In 2016, they expanded it. So it's almost like they dipped their toe in the water with the first one.
Just to see how it would go.
Exactly, yeah. And expanded it to 16 other different modalities of natural medicine, including things like naturopathy. Massage of all types. Including like remedial massage.
And the significance of this, so people understand, is that this was what was really used as a basis for the government to then remove private health insurance rebates for a number of natural medicine modalities.
Yep.
That's right.
So that's now scheduled to happen in April 2019, as I understand it, across Australia.
Correct.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that means removing rebates essentially, which means that you'll be paying out of pocket for so many of these modalities that people choose.
Yeah, so it's not eliminating naturopathy, for example, or homeopathy.
No.
But it's certainly making it a heck of a lot harder for people to access.
As I understand it, it is affecting, it's trickle-down effect. So once you start to say there's no, effectiveness of this, then that changes the opportunity for people to study it. It changes what it looks like in universities in terms of how the course is structured, if it's offered at all.
Yep.
Yeah.
So this is really significant when we have questionable studies that influence public policy at a big level and influence the future of that modality in a country, which it will do if it impacts the ability of people to study it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The other interesting thing that the influence of this report will have is what's referred to as the Health Complaints Commissioner as well. So this was introduced in Victoria, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before. It's a level of not regulation, but a complaints process for a lot of natural medicines that don't fall under APRA. There's a lot of people asking questions of the Health Complaints Commissioner in some sessions I was in where they're asking, are you going to use this NHMRC report in your evaluation whether the complaint is valid or not? So i.e. if somebody has a complaint about a naturopath and then they use this report as evidence. Effectively,
and the report says it's not effective.
Exactly, which pretty much means anything that the naturopath does is not valid.
Yeah.
They really did not want to answer the question.
No,
they kept tiptoeing around it again and again and again, but heaps of people just kept asking.
Because that's damning, like that.
Yeah.
That will derail a profession.
Yeah.
If that's allowed to be the status quo, essentially.
Absolutely. And short of saying the words yes, they pretty much said we will be utilising the research available and
and there's no kind of red flag on research that's with the Ombudsman for there's not a red flag on that because it's in review. No.
Not that I'm aware of. Okay. I don't think, given that they've just made legislation around it, using that as their evidence, I'd say that
this is why the personal's political, right?
Because that's right. It affects your everyday life.
The choices that we can take for granted might not be a choice anymore.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad that we've had some of these conversations. Is there anything else that you guys want to cover off before we wrap it up?
I think there's some statistics I heard just a couple of weeks ago which just floored me, just around chronic disease.
Oh, yeah.
So, and this is one of the things where the current approach to the medical system to me is failing. So there's some things that it does absolutely brilliantly, especially with acute conditions and things. There's things that are absolutely brilliant. There's a lot of awesome doctors and nurses and things, but there's some things that it doesn't do so well. Chronic disease is one of those key things. And you kind of go, but we're healthier, aren't we? We're living longer and we're healthier. Isn't that the general standard approach? In terms of living longer.
We live longer.
Isn't this the first generation where children are not expected to outlive their parents? When they're talking about the rates of obesity and chronic disease in children has risen so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. And it's these elements of we might live longer in the current stage, but, are our kids and at what cost?
And at what quality?
Yeah. And so the rates of chronic disease, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare just released a report just this year, and they noted that 1 in 2, so 50% of Australians are estimated to have at least one of 8 selected common chronic conditions.
Wow.
That's like 1 in 2 people.
Yeah.
And that's over only 8 chronic conditions. Like there's a massive amount of chronic conditions as well. Yet these are only like just 8 common ones between, like cancer, cardiovascular disease, mental health conditions, arthritis, back pain and problems, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, asthma and diabetes. Just those ones. I mean, there's some big ones in there, but chronic disease goes well beyond those figures.
Yeah, I mean, I was astounded to see a report that was published in mainstream media a couple of weeks ago. I was talking about 65% of visits to GPs are mental health related.
Wow.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And so what that says is we're woefully, inadequate in the ways in which we help people resource themselves to live healthier lifestyles.
I think that's absolutely the point. And one of the reasons that I decided to stand is it's about, we've forgotten about people. We've forgotten about people's needs. If we can meet people's needs in their area when they need them, they don't end up with big problems at the end that government's trying to deal with.
Yeah.
And there's multiple modalities for how to do that, but you actually have to have your ears and eyes open for what it is that people need and when they need it most. And I think families, when you become a parent, that's the perfect time to have that connection with people about servicing their needs and following that through. We really would change the course of most of those issues later on if we could meet people's needs at that point. And you know what? It's actually not that hard.
Yeah. They are kind of basic, can't they?
They're really basic.
But we take a while to learn.
Yeah.
I love this excerpt from this wellness manifesto, which was written by Professor Mark Cohen, who's a medical doctor and a professor in the School of Health Sciences at RMIT. It was published on the Health Australia website. And he says, we are begging to learn that everything is interconnected, that individual actions have planetary consequences, and that if we are to survive, we must adopt conscious consumption patterns that transform corporate behaviour and create communities of informed and engaged citizens. It seems ironic, however, that at a time when mobile devices give us unprecedented ability to connect with the world, we have never been more out of touch with the earth and each other. Yet there is cause for hope, for while the need has never been so great, the tools at our disposal have never been more powerful. And I so love that as a way to, I guess, end our conversation, because we do have tools at our disposal. We have the ability to learn so much more than we ever could before with, our access to research and to other people's world experiences and, with our choice to who we vote for. So I hope that this has given our listeners a bit of an insight into, one of the many choices you can make when you go to the polls in a few weeks if you're in Victoria, and then next year if you're, living in other states in Australia, and of course internationally if you're listening. Who is it that represents your values and your views in your country? How do you connect with them? It'd be really interesting to look at that, because we do make an impact with the choices that we make.
When I was growing up, I had this little poster next to my bed. I don't even know where it came from originally, but it was a cartoon of the Statue of Liberty with scaffolding all around it. And it said, the work on the ideal world has been halted due to a lack of idealists. Wow. And that has just stayed with me forever. And there's this idea that we can't be critical thinkers and idealists at the same time. And I totally disagree that if you want the world to be better, you got to do work on it. You can't just hope that someone else is going to do it. And you can also complain about the way the world is and imagine that it can be better.
And use that feeling and that sense of, desiring to complain about it as fuel to do something about it.
Yeah. Something positive.
Because, we use it purposefully. Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for being part of the podcast and for sharing your insights. And I want to remind our listeners, if you want to connect with us, it's at nourishingthemother.com.au, Nourishing the Mother on Facebook, Instagram and Pinterest. If you want to connect with Jules, it's thepleasurenutritionist.com and me, suburbansandcastles.com. Remember to nourish the mother to rock the family, and we'll see you next week when we continue to peel back the layers on your mothering journey.
This has been a production of TheWellnessCouch.com. Check us out on Facebook and join in the conversation on Facebook.com/The Wellness Couch. Subscribe to each show on iTunes and check us out on Twitter. The Wellness Couch, streaming wellness into your lives. Whilst the Wellness Couch presenter endeavor to provide accurate and helpful information to their listeners, these podcasts cannot take into account individual circumstances and are not intended to be a substitute for health and medical advice from a qualified health professional. You should always seek the advice of a qualified health professional before acting on any of the information provided by any of the Wellness Couch podcasts.